Every artist reaches a point where success turns into expectation. For Jungkook, that point came long ago, hidden behind the polished perfection of every stage performance. The image that millions adored was built through relentless precision, discipline, and control. Yet control, when stretched too far, starts to suffocate. Korea saw Jungkook as flawless, and in that perfection, they forgot he was still learning, still evolving. Every move was judged against a standard that no human could sustain forever. There's a kind of pressure that no spotlight can reveal, the one that grows from the inside, where every choice is watched and every word is weighed. For Jungkook, the line between art and expectation blurred. When he sang, people didn't just hear his voice. They demanded the voice they had already imagined. When he performed, they didn't see a man, they saw an ideal. Leaving Korea wasn't about turning his back on his homeland. It was about stepping beyond the frame that had become too narrow for what he had grown to be. The moment he left, the silence that followed wasn't emptiness, it was clarity. It was as if he had taken a breath for the first time in years. In that silence, he wasn't the Jungkook the nation had created. He was simply himself, stripped of the weight of representation, free to rediscover what music, movement, and creation truly meant to him. Korea had given Jungkook everything: discipline, identity, and a platform that the world couldn't ignore. But it also gave him an environment where privacy had no real existence. Every detail of his daily life could become a public debate. The places he went, the people he met, the gestures he made, all became evidence for narratives others built for him. He didn't lose his freedom in a dramatic moment. He lost it slowly, piece by piece, until one day he realized he had none left to protect. Leaving Korea was his quiet rebellion against invisibility, not from fans, but from himself. In foreign lands, he found what Korea had made impossible: the ability to walk unnoticed, to breathe without judgment, to create without expectation. There, he could fail privately and rise again without headlines. He could experiment with his sound, his style, and his identity without the noise of instant criticism that had followed him for years. To outsiders, it may seem like a geographical shift from Seoul to Los Angeles, or perhaps Tokyo. But for Jungkook, it was a psychological shift. He wasn't running away from Korea, he was running toward a version of himself that couldn't exist there. That's the part most couldn't understand. Leaving wasn't loss, it was recovery. For an artist whose name alone could fill stadiums, success had already been achieved. Yet that success had also become a trap. Every record broken became another chain of expectation. Every achievement demanded another. There was no longer a horizon to chase, only repetition in different forms. Jungkook knew that staying would mean more of the same. Another tour, another award, another song polished for perfection. It wasn't about boredom, it was about evolution. He wanted to see what his art would sound like, without limits, without labels, without the cultural precision that defined K-pop structure. In leaving, he wasn't rejecting Korea's system, he was testing what lay beyond it. The world had already accepted him as a global artist. He no longer needed permission. What he needed was distance from routine, from the machine, from the identity that had become both armor and cage. Some may say he owed everything to his origin. In truth, he had already paid that debt 1,000 times over. The legacy he built for Korean music is permanent. Leaving wasn't erasure, it was expansion. It was about carrying what he learned and transforming it into something new, something unfiltered. And in that pursuit, geography became irrelevant. His artistry was now borderless, his voice unconfined by nationality. There's an irony in fame. The more the world loves you, the less you belong to yourself. Jungkook's life became a timeline of public moments, curated and analyzed in real time. Fans could map his existence through cameras and posts. Every airport became a battlefield of lenses. Every glance turned into a rumor. There was no offstage, only extensions of performance. What few understood was how deeply this shaped his reality. Even when he stood smiling under the lights, his mind existed in fragments, part performer, part protector, part wanderer. Over time, he stopped seeing himself as one person. Korea had turned him into an idea. That idea was flawless, but it wasn't human. Leaving was not an act of rejection, it was self-preservation. He needed to remember what it felt like to be unobserved, to make choices that wouldn't be dissected, to wake up without the weight of a nation's expectations on his shoulders. He didn't vanish, he reclaimed his existence. When the news spread that Jungkook had left Korea, interpretations filled every corner of social media. Some said it was about career strategy, others claimed it was burnout or conflict or personal renewal. Yet none of these could truly capture it. The truth was simpler but harder to accept. He had reached a level of clarity that required distance. In the place he moved to wherever it was, there were no billboards of his face, no cameras waiting at airports, no rehearsed appearances. There was only the sound of his own voice, the rhythm of normal life. And within that simplicity, he found what years of perfection had taken from him: peace. Not the kind bought by success, but the kind earned by silence. His story became a paradox. The man who gave everything to his country had to leave it to find himself again. That paradox is what made his decision unimaginable to many. But to him, it was inevitable. True freedom isn't about going anywhere you want, it's about being able to stay still without fear. Jungkook's departure wasn't an escape from responsibility. It was the moment he stopped apologizing for wanting more than applause. In Korea, every move he made had a purpose. Abroad, he could move without purpose, and that's what made it real. He wasn't chasing anonymity, he was chasing authenticity. And authenticity demands space, mental, emotional, creative, that fame rarely allows. By leaving, he wasn't abandoning his legacy, he was protecting it. He knew that if he stayed, the perfection expected of him would eventually consume the art that built him. He chose distance over decay, renewal over routine. And so, the departure that shocked millions wasn't a fall. It was a rise one, invisible to cameras, but deeply visible to anyone who understood what it means to begin again. The moment Jungkook left, Korea wasn't an ending. It was the quiet start of something larger than before. The country that once defined him will always remain a part of his identity, but it no longer confines him. His journey isn't about where he came from anymore, it's about where he can go when the weight of expectation is finally lifted. He's no longer running a race for approval, he's walking his own path, where success isn't measured by views or charts, but by how true he can be to himself. And perhaps that's the most unimaginable part of all, that the boy who once carried a nation's pride now walks freely, carrying only his own truth. The public wanted an explanation, but explanations are for logic. His decision came from something deeper than logic. Sometimes the most profound choices are made not in words, but in silence and action. For Jungkook, art had always been more than performance. It was how he processed life. But when art becomes work, it loses its meaning. During his years in Korea, art had gradually become production, rehearsed, scheduled, and commercialized. There was pride in it, but also fatigue. Abroad, in his new surroundings, he began creating without deadlines. Music wasn't an obligation anymore. It was a conversation with himself. The melodies were different, less polished, more raw. They carried traces of freedom, fragments of uncertainty, but also life. In those imperfect sounds, he found truth again. And truth, not perfection, became his new goal. He started writing not to please, but to understand. Not to perform, but to express. That shift changed everything. It reminded him of why he started in the first place, not to be adored, but to connect. In Korea, Jungkook's presence had become constant. People grew used to seeing him everywhere in performances, advertisements, interviews. His name was a part of everyday conversation. But absence, in its quiet power, made the world realize what it had taken for granted. When he was gone, people began to see how much space he had actually occupied, not just in media, but in emotion. His departure made the country feel smaller, not because he left physically, but because his silence echoed through every space he once filled. That silence forced reflection on how easily society consumes its artists, how quickly it demands, and how rarely it gives back. In leaving, Jungkook became a mirror for his audience. People began asking why someone so loved, so successful, would still choose distance. The answer was hidden in the question itself, because love, when it becomes possession, ceases to be love. Outside Korea, Jungkook began to experience what fame could look like when it wasn't tied to identity. He wasn't the Korean artist anymore. He was simply Jungkook, the voice, the presence, the individual. That shift might seem small, but for him, it changed everything. It freed him from being a representative and allowed him to be a creator. He found comfort in cities where people didn't whisper when he passed, where he could sit in cafes unnoticed, where he could see sunsets without cameras flashing. These small details, which most people take for granted, became symbols of his newfound freedom. And perhaps most profoundly, he discovered that in losing his audience's constant gaze, he had gained something else: authenticity. The world that once watched him had taught him performance. The world that now ignored him taught him peace. When people think of home, they often think of geography, a country, a city, a language. But for Jungkook, home had always been tied to people, purpose, and balance. Korea was his birthplace, his foundation. But as he grew, so did his understanding of what home truly meant. It wasn't about returning to a place, it was about returning to a state of mind. In his quiet solitude abroad, he began to build a new kind of home, one made not of walls and traditions, but of simplicity and space. A home where he could breathe freely, where creativity wasn't demanded, but chosen. The more he found peace within, the less he felt the need to be defined by where he came from. He didn't leave Korea because it wasn't home anymore. He left because he needed to redefine what home means when your entire life has been public. Every great artist eventually faces a moment where they must choose between comfort and truth. Jungkook chose truth. His story didn't end with his departure from Korea, it simply changed direction. What he's building now isn't a rebellion against his past, but a continuation of it, seen through new eyes. His absence may still puzzle many, but one thing remains certain. This decision wasn't made for applause. It was made for growth. And growth often demands solitude, not as isolation, but as preparation for what's next. In the years to come, people will look back at this moment not as an ending, but as the turning point, the time when Jungkook, the icon, chose to become Jungkook, the individual. And in that choice, he didn't lose himself. He finally found himself,